One of the things that I've really been focused on over the last year and a half, 2 years, is really a broader picture of teaching people and making people excited about being and becoming software developers. And so that's taken a bunch of forums, podcasting, online training, conference speaking, things like that. So maybe we could start with that.
Cool. Yeah, so give me just a super high level background of where you came from and how you got into this, online podcasting teaching sort of
Yeah,
world.
sure. So I started out actually in Southern California in San Diego, doing programming to basically fill in the gaps around my graduate school math education. And I realized after a while that more or less I enjoyed the actual programming part more than the math research. Like I'd be working on a math programming problem. I would love it until I had to solve a math problem. They're like, okay, I gotta go do this, And so then after a while, it occurred to me, maybe I should not get a PhD in math, but I should rather go into programming. So it all started back there. And somehow I never really got a formal education in computer science. I took a few computer science for a minor in college, but I've always been self-taught. And I've always, because of that, sort of felt not inadequate, but a little underprepared, a little like I don't quite have the background to do what I'm trying to do. I think a lot of people in computer science, even if they have degrees, feel this way. But so I just started learning and reading, and just every single day I would take, a half hour or something and try to learn design patterns, C++, you name it. And,
And was that while you were in school or in your job?
That was
what
while,
did you do this half an hour learning?
Yeah, it was tough when I was in grad school because there's so much work to be a grad student. So it was more during breaks. But once I got a job, once I decided, all right, I'm going to just go straight into programming, I started working at a scientific visualization company. And I decided, like, okay, well, I better start taking this seriously and treat it kind of like a graduate education, right? I made myself like a study plan, and I started a self-study thing. And it really surprised me after 5 years of doing that, how far you can get in this industry. A lot of people, they learn one certain thing, or they get pretty good and they just kind of roll with it. But if you just make small little incremental improvements, I started speaking at conferences and code camps, and that was really fun. And then a company called Developmentor saw that I was doing these presentations at code camps. They're like, hey, we would pay you for a job if you want to go to this, like more full time. So I spent like 10 years doing training and traveling around the world, working with companies. And then, eventually I decided that's all great, but you reach 10, 20 people at a time, if like a big conference, a couple hundred for an hour, but that's not the same as the internet, as you know, right? With your podcast and with my podcast, and I know your YouTube stuff you've done, like you can really make a difference if you can find a place to speak to the whole world, not just to a small group. So,
cool. So how did you start giving talks on this stuff? Because it seems like you were self-taught in programming and you're learning this stuff on your own, but how did you start thinking about, I'm going to actually give talks on this stuff while I'm learning?
Yeah, it took a bit of a mental shift because, like I said, I always felt like I was playing catch up. So who am I to go stand in the front of the room and tell people anything, right? Like I was trying to find a place at the table, basically. And so I really got into design patterns and studying that a lot. And I realized a lot of the people I'd talk to, I'd go to, like meetups and various things just as an attendee. And I realized the people I spoke to, they were missing all these skills. I'm like, why does nobody know this? This stuff is really cool. These things I've been learning. I'm like, well, if no one else is going to talk about it, I'll just throw it out there and see if somebody is interested, and just, take a deep breath and see how it goes. And that's kind of how it started. And that's more or less how it's been going.
Cool. So then in the last, I guess, before the current, podcast era, you were doing mostly these corporate training, teaching.
Yeah, mostly in person. Absolutely. And the majority of that would be, you would go to some company. So maybe I would go to Microsoft and teach a class, or I'd go to some other company in San Francisco and teach a class. And they're really fun, right? You really learn so much by teaching. You do that all day, right? Like you just get so much deeper than if you just have to make a problem, or you just have to solve a problem, make a thing work. Because, imagine there's like 3 ways to do a thing, right? 3 ways to run threads or whatever. And when you're trying to solve a problem, you get one way to work. You're like, good, it works. right? But if you're teaching it, people are going to ask, well, there's these 3 ways, which one is better? When do I use that? Like, you have to know those things. And so I really felt like just getting into the teaching space made a huge boost in how I was as a developer. It was really, really gratifying.
Right. And you're saying that, so how much software development work were you doing at this time versus the teaching work?
Sure. That's if it was just teaching, that's like a big danger, right? Like if you don't really have the experience, like how are you to go and talk about it? So I, for like 7 years before then, I had done pure development, and this had switched me to about 50-50. So I always had some sort of side project I was working on. I'd work for the training company I was working for. We did lots of internal software. We redid their website, their e-commerce stuff, like all of those things we would do on the weeks we weren't teaching.
Yeah, when I worked at I visited this thing called Recurse Center, or it used to be called Hacker School when I went, and they have these facilitators who are full-time employees there, and they mostly mentor and teach kind of the attendees, but on at the same time, since these are all very technical CS people, they build a lot of the internal infrastructure and manage things for managing interviews and things for managing personnel and stuff. So it's very much this dogfooding thing, which is really important, as you said, especially when you're teaching really pragmatic programming sort of stuff.
Yeah, it sounds really familiar. It sounds like the life I lived for not too long ago.
Right. So the way I knew you is you actually invited me on your podcast last year, and I think that was probably the first podcast I did, and I'm pretty sure that I will credit you with kind of seeding this idea in my head of doing podcasts of my own. And so I was on your podcast to talk about Python. So and I've just been impressed by, you have hundreds now of these interviews up, and I'm just fascinated by this journey that you have of podcasting and how you're making this into kind of a career shift. And I just love to talk about that.
No, it's like a dream come true. It really is. And I really appreciated you coming on the show. Those were pretty early days. I think you were episode 22. Yeah, episode 22, if I remember correctly. And we talked about the C Python internals, which was such a fantastic episode. I think a lot of people, they use Python and they just see the outer shell, so that was really cool. But when I started, I had no idea that it could be a job. What I wanted was, I wanted to get deeper into the Python community, and I loved podcasts as a consumer of podcasts. And so I looked around I'm like, all right, it's time to switch. I'm moving into the Python world. Where are the podcasts? Who should I be listening to hear the stories and go deeper, right? And I looked, and there were none, like not few or not poor quality. There were 0 Python podcasts. And I thought, this is just insane. There's like this community of millions of people, and there's no podcast whatsoever.
And what year was that?
That was 2015.
Oh, it's very recent. It's extremely recent.
Yeah, it's extremely unusual, right? So there had been a number of Python podcasts, but they all had faded. It all pod faded. So they had, there was something to the effect of, well, we're going to release a little less frequently now, but don't worry, we're not going away. And then like 3 months later, there's one more episode, and then that's it, right? And it was sad, and those guys did a good job, but just for personal reasons, they, I guess, stopped, right?
Well, and this brings up a big issue of not just Python podcasts, any podcast or any blogging or creative content people do online. You start enthusiastic, and then sustainability is ultimately the big question on everyone's minds, right? How do you keep sustaining that?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And I think there's a couple reasons that I got into it. I found it extremely rewarding to be the host of a podcast, because I got to talk to people like you. I got to talk to like the people inside Netflix and the Large Hadron Collider and like all these places where nobody would talk to me, like, because who am I? I'm a guy like up here in Portland, right? But when you have them on your show, as you know, they're very open, and people are generally really happy to come. So I found this place where I could have these amazing conversations with amazing people. And so that was really compelling to keep doing it. The community was really appreciative that there was, once again, a Python podcast. Now there's a couple more, but at the time they're like, wow, thank you for bringing this back to us. This is great. And so initially there was just lots of rewards, for me personally in that way. And then almost by accident, well, not intentionally, let's say, companies started approaching me and saying, hey, would you take a sponsorship for your podcast? Like, well, I didn't really think it was popular or big or important enough to have a sponsor, but sure, if you want to sponsor it, no problem. You have a cool product, why not?
And I see. So that they approached you, and it was, so did you do, what publicity did you create for your podcast before the first sponsorship started? Let's say in 2015. Sure.
So there were 3 basic places that it launched. I put it in all the podcast directories, which basically means iTunes, right? But I also created a SoundCloud account. I created, I put it in Google Play Store once that came out. There's other smaller secondary places you can put podcasts. So I put it there. That was pretty good. I did a lot on Twitter. I didn't have that many Twitter followers at the time, but people seemed really appreciative. And there were people with 10 or 20,000 Twitter followers who would, like, in the early days, help me announce every show. And so they would make a big deal, and they had the power to bring people to know about it. Right. So a lot on social media, and then on my blog is mildly popular.
Nice. So then you got that, and then the companies started approaching you with sponsorship opportunities. And then, so at this time, you were not full-time doing the podcast, I assume?
No. This was a part-time thing. I was doing it in my spare time. I was doing it in weird hours. Like, I would do it at 9:30 to 11 at night. And I'd edit on Saturday mornings, and just, it was really stressful in that regard. But at the same time, it was also really rewarding. And to see it grow, it was just great. So it was cool that I was getting some support from these companies coming in. Eventually, I started to reach out to other ones as this concept of it being a legitimate thing solidified in my mind, as other people thought it was. Like, well, maybe it is.
Right. So did you feel that the initial company sponsorship gave you more confidence and helped you say, look, we have these sponsors, I would like to get more. These really legit places are sponsoring.
Yes, absolutely. And people who are listening, they're thinking, like, how do you do that? I didn't have millions of downloads when I got my first sponsors, right? I had, I don't know, thousands, like a couple thousand, 5,000, 10,000, nothing insane. I don't even think that's per episode. That might've been total, in the early days. Now it's into the millions, but in the early days, it was really small. And it's just, if you reach out to people, I mean, they contacted me, I was lucky, but if you find companies that are trying to reach a specific niche and you focus on that niche, even though you might not be huge, you might not be a giant magazine or a TV station, it's a really valuable medium for people to reach out through. And so if other people are listening and they want to know how that goes, give it a shot. It's more likely to work than you would think initially. At least it was more likely to work than I thought. But that basically gave me the ability to have enough income off the podcast to say, all right, let me make a plan for the future. And if I believe I have a plan that I can grow this business of teaching people and making them excited about programming in Python, I'll sort of take the leap, quit my job, and go full-time into doing this. And so basically we were out skiing in the winter. And I took a book, and I had a lot of time to sit by the fire and think. And I went and just thought for a week. And when I came back, I'm like, all right, that's it. I'm doing this, And so in February, it took a while to unravel all my commitments. In February, I left and started doing podcasting and online courses to sort of complement that for my job.
Wow. So this is February 2016 then.
Yeah. So we're like 9 months into this journey.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it seems like this ski lodge notebook week was influential, and it's funny because in a lot of things in life, these decisions get made within a really short span, but it's because things have built up over time, right? It wasn't an impulsive decision overnight. It was these things, momentum has built up, and then there's some kind of a tipping point.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd been doing the podcast for, I guess, 8 months prior to that, maybe 9 months, something like that. And for a long time, I'd wanted to start my own set of courses. I think that what's out there, we can do a better job for everybody. But being a full-time employee at a company that would basically say, well, you can go create those courses, but those are our courses, right? Well, I'm like, I don't really want to make courses for you. I would like to try this for myself, right? So it took a lot of thinking, and it was really stressful to think, all right, I'm going to do this. But I think we're also in our field quite lucky in that there's a lot of demand, right? Like, I guess one of my ski lodge thoughts was, well, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? I'm going to have to go get a job like the one I have.
Right. And I think that's a great, being, fortunate to that computer programming skills, especially in something like Python now, is so in demand, and that you've been well connected by working it for many years. That, yeah, I think that's a great thought. That it does seem risky on the face of it. It's like, what if this thing doesn't work out? But it's, if you actually, like you said, frame it in terms of, if it doesn't work out, then I will get a job like the one I had before, and it seems
Right.
things will be okay.
Right. Absolutely. So it's all about the way you see it, but also I had carefully built up a base of following, something that I felt that it would be somewhat sustaining. It's not like I had an idea and I quit my job, then I tried it. I don't want to give people a false sense of hope, right? You want to make sure the thing that you're going to jump into is pretty viable before you shake up your world too much.
Right, right. And I would assume that financially, you have the numbers coming in, you have data over a year and stuff in terms of income from sponsorships and stuff, that you felt pretty confident that it wasn't just going to suddenly drop to zero. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's sort of two parts. One thing was right before we left for our ski break in the end of December, early January, is I had talked to a company that was interested in coming on, and they had bought an entire year of sponsorships. So I could look at how much I was going to make over the next year. I'm like, I could actually live on this. Okay, if I have a year runway and something I think I can do, that's not that risky, right? Like,
interesting. So by this kind of sponsorship thing, does this mean that, let's say you did not produce any more podcasts, but you just put ads or whatever on the existing ones, is there an expectation that you produce however many more? Like, you got to do one a week or something, or you could just put some on existing ones?
No, it was one a week for the future. And so that's one thing that was really stressful for me, is I was trying to start the online courses business, and I was trying to do the podcast. And it turns out I spend probably 10 hours a week on research per episode, because I want to have a really informed conversation. In the beginning, it was easy because I could talk to people about things I knew, but the farther out you go, the less you know about the things you might talk about, right? So it's a lot of work, and it was just getting really stressful. So I ended up actually hiring an audio editor to help edit the audio, and that took like 3 hours off my gave me 3 hours back. I hired somebody to do scheduling, and these are not huge amounts of money, but they really make a difference in the mental, just sort of the weight that is on your shoulders and so on.
That's right. And I think with a lot of these things, you can get, remote workers or people to do contract work and stuff. And, for me, since I have a very different design point, right, that these things are purely a hobby for me at this point. And I feel like having to be on a set schedule, like we got to produce one a week, is really hard, I think, because for me, it's purely a hobby. So whenever I can get interesting people on, I get interesting people on. If I don't, then that's fine. If I get busy for a month with school or whatever, right? So I just have a few people on now because the timing works out, or I just bring up the idea to friends or colleagues, that I meet, and I said, oh, if you're interested in talking about X, I'd love to have you on. And they're like, I'm busy right now, but maybe in a few months. And I pester them a few months later, like, oh yeah, I have a break now, let's do it. So for me, it's very much an organic thing that I don't need to set to schedule. So I guess a question for you in that regard is, how are you able to get that delivered on time, on schedule, scheduling guests and getting people and keeping fresh and keeping motivated? Because that, I feel, is really challenging.
It is. It is challenging. I really enjoy the whole experience, so I'm always happy to do it. And even, no matter how much you like something, there's always times where you just don't feel like doing it. I remember times where I'm just thinking, oh, I have a headache, I'm tired, I'm like recording at some odd time. I just don't want to. I'll do it because I've got this schedule, right? And I'll go through it. And what's really funny is almost every time I've had that thought, I came away an hour later going, wow, that was fantastic. I learned so much. I'm so glad I forced myself through that. And I guess having enough of those experiences helps sort of keep the ball rolling. But it is stressful. But on the other hand, if it were fully your job to record one of these a week, you would have a lot more time, and it wouldn't feel so stressful. You wouldn't try to fit it in around all the edges, but it could be, if you could dedicate 2 days a week or a day and a half a week or something like that, let's say, to doing this, you could pull off an hour a week.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, because it's like if you're, if you're creating a TV show or something, you have to record a show a week, but that's your full-time gig. You basically, that's the thing that's on your mind all the time. So you kind of wrap your pace around that. Whereas if you're doing it like you used to be, and like I'm doing now as a side thing, then it seems like stressful. It's like, how do I fit this in around all my schedule?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's actually harder to do it as a hobby than it is to do as a full-time thing, because you have way more other things pulling on your time and taking your attention and whatnot.
Right. Yeah. And I guess the broader theme that I'm interested in talking about is just this challenge of making money, both making money on the internet and making money from open source free-ish things that, both software and content. Yeah. This is something it's a big issue nowadays, especially for creative types like yourself who want to sustain that way. So what are your thoughts about that?
I'm fascinated to talk about this. And every time I have somebody on my show who is somehow working that angle, I always try to ask them about it, because I think open source has really soared in the last 10 years, especially in the last 5 years. It's just, it's exploding, right? And how do we make money off of these free things? Not in the sense of like shrewd capitalism where it's going to like, but if you're going to dedicate yourself to it, you need to be able to eat. You know what I mean? Right? Like the fact that I have sponsors for my show, I think people don't mind that there's a 30-second ad here and there, because they know that means the show is going to be around. That means that I'm going to put in the extra effort to make it a good, well-researched project, not just something I'm quickly throwing together and it might fade any day, right? So I think that there's a parallel to open source in this sense. Right? Like, how do these open source projects maintain themselves? There's a variety of ways in which people are doing it, and it's super fascinating. I feel like I'm a little bit sort of on the sidelines of that story, but my classes are about open source. My podcast is about the open source community. And so I do feel like I'm somewhat lumped into that.
Yeah, I mean, both of us know about the challenges of sustaining open source software as well. And it is, for the amount of effort people put in and the amount of economic value it has, just the level of underfunding and support, in a purely shrewd capitalist economy doesn't support it, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, there's a really interesting book. I just had an episode on my show about PyPI, which is, and basically the infrastructure of Python. So PyPI, read the docs, some of these things that they're not themselves open source projects in the sense that people want to take and build on them, but they use them for open source, right? Anytime you have a package, you put it on PyPI, you pip install off of there, right? Or you create a project, you probably put it on read the docs and people get their documentation there. And there's actually a really big problem in the Python space around funding those types of things. So I had an episode, I think it was 84, yeah. And the guys on there, Eric, one of my guests, suggested this book, or this is actually a report called Roads and Bridges, the Unseen Labor Behind Our Digital Infrastructure. And that's it's like a 100-page report by this research group, and it's fascinating. So I feel like some of the popular projects like Django and Jupyter Notebooks and all that kind of stuff, they're doing pretty well because there's a lot of companies directly benefiting from those. There's other ones. If you look at Scrapey. So do you know Scrapey?
No.
It's an open source project for scraping web pages, kind of like Beautiful Soup as well. And so you can like download the HTML and suck out the data and then do whatever. And so I had this guy on my show, Pablo, and he created this project and he really wanted to make it his job. So how do you make a web scraping library your job? And I thought about that for a while and we talked a little bit. And I'm like, I have no idea how to do this. Maybe you sell support. One way is maybe sell contracting. Well, what he ended up doing was making, the thing is free, right? It's open source, you can do whatever. But he said one of the challenges is actually setting up the infrastructure to do this at scale. So he created Scraping Hub, which is a place that is basically web scraping as a service.
Cool.
Based on this. And I said, okay, well, that's cool. Like, is that a couple of guys working on it? He's like, oh, no, we have 130 employees.
Wow.
Oh my gosh, 130 employees, like basically based on this open source web scraping project. How cool is that?
Yeah, right? That's huge. Yeah, and I guess on the other end, is your goal for this, I guess in the near term, to keep it fairly small as a one-person show? You might hire some remote workers to assist you, but is that the kind of one way to get runway on that?
Yeah, that's certainly been my plan. I looked at what the other podcasts were doing and why they didn't continue. And I think one of the challenges people were running into, and I've seen this happen to one of the ones that's sort of somewhat current, is if you have, say, like 4 people who are part of the show, you all get together every week, like it's already hard enough to schedule me. You try to like take the combinatorial challenges of all the 4 people, maybe plus a guest. It just gets really, really sluggish to try to keep those going. And so I tried to keep it light and simple and not have a lot of friction in that sense, so I could keep it going. So that's really cool. I did recently start a second podcast.
Right, that's the Python Bytes one, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so what is that one? How does that differ from your main one?
Sure. So my main one, I think of Python Bytes as like flicking through the Facebook newsfeed, where Talk Python is like reading something in like a long form article or something, right? So that's like a proper long, deep research type of conversation into a topic. The Python Bytes is 6 headlines in 15 minutes for the week. So just what's coming out, right? Like,
yeah, a related question to this would be, one of the things I've heard about when I was talking about podcasts with people is that there are people who prefer to read for one reason or another. So have you thought about having transcripts or written form? So NPR does this, I think, really well. They have an audio story for 10 minutes and they have an article version of the story. It's basically a transcript, but it's it's cleaned up so it looks like an essay. I mean, have you thought about that?
Yes, I know what you're talking about with NPR, and that is really cool, and I haven't thought about that. So that's a super interesting idea, because on one hand, I do have straight transcripts, and that's another person that I've hired to help create the transcripts, because that's a tremendous amount of work, and I couldn't do it. But I have got I don't know, 70 hours of transcripts already, and she's working on more of them now. But that's a lot of transcripts. But to turn those into a more readable form, because reading is different than reading spoken word, I think that's not quite the same experience. So
yeah, and I guess a question for this, I mean, while we're brainstorming on the fly is, I've often heard that, advertisements, people are getting pretty ad blind to visual advertisements, right? You're reading a Python blog or whatever, and you pop up Python ads, and people have ad block or they don't care, and it's just hard to make money off of interstitial ads inside of articles. Do you feel like the ad revenue or sponsorship from podcasts is actually a bigger slice of the pie, and people are more willing to pay for that than print ads?
Yes, absolutely. I think you need to get the same amount of money for some kind of like internet reading type thing. You need like 10 or 50 times the traffic you do for podcasts, because it's so built in, right? You're having a conversation and the conversation just continues for 30 seconds on this other thing. And there's something weird about listening to podcasts if you listen to them frequently, in that you feel like you know and trust the host. I feel this way about podcasts I listen to. I feel like I know some of these people. I've spent hundreds of hours listening to them speak. I know what
that's a great point, because they're in your ear. Because I listen to a lot of podcasts. If I'm exercising, I'm doing household errands, and I totally know what you mean. And I think you're talking, and you have these well-placed ads, as is you're talking, and then all right, let's take a break for now, and then here's 30 seconds. I'm gonna give a spiel, and then we're gonna go back. And if that's done well, it's not like someone's gonna like fast forward and skip 30 seconds because they're in the middle of exercising and stuff, so they'll just keep listening. Like you're just talking about a product, then you're just talking back. Whereas the ads, print ads, well, I guess visual ads on web pages now, people have just become so ad blind to them, and it is becoming kind of a race to the bottom of like, we need jumping out monkeys, flashing everywhere.
It's really, really bad. And then you now have viruses that are sneaking in through the ad networks, and so it's almost a requirement to be like responsible for your personal information to like somehow protect against that. And how are you going to do this? It's the print stuff is really, it's a challenge.
Yeah, so maybe that's one argument for, I didn't even thought about it. Maybe this is one argument for focusing on this audio model, and maybe the the print curated article model isn't worth the time, right? If you had infinite time, it'd be great, but maybe it's not worth the time as much, because the potential for greater exposure sponsor-wise may not be great. But it's good to have.
It's really interesting. So you have to think of all these little pillars that you build up your digital identity in your digital world with, right? If you just put your stuff on iTunes, that will have some effect. If you have another web page that has some extra resources, that's really good. But one of the things that the thing you're speaking about would really, really help with is SEO. So if somebody searches for something about the thing your little sub article is about, that thing could rank #1 in Google. And all of a sudden you could get 100,000 downloads to your podcast, not because of your podcast at all, but sort of indirectly from this. what I had planned on doing when I was thinking about how would I get my podcast popular, and I've since given up on this idea because the cost benefit ratio of time is changed. But one of my original plans was I'm going to have transcripts for my show, which is true. I have transcripts on Talk Python, and I'm going to put them on Python Bytes, and then maybe that'll boost the SEO. But my other thought was, well, maybe I could take like the 10 most interesting episodes, like you say, turn them into kind of essays, and then put it into like an ebook that I can self-publish on Kindle or something like that. And so people would come in, maybe they'd be looking in the Kindle store or iBooks or something. They would find this thing that they would then discover the podcast, and they would discover all the other things that I have going on, and bring them in that way and use it almost as just pure publicity.
It's all, like you said, time, and it's a time cost thing. If you had time to do everything, you would do all of it.
Yeah, I kind of feel like I could run my second podcast and create a bunch of cool courses people are excited about, or I could write this book. And I'm like, if that's the trade-off, I'm going to do those other two things. But it is a really interesting idea. And maybe at some point I will go back and do it, because I think it would be a really cool contribution to really put those excellent stories that, are coming out of these kinds of conversations and just frame them in a way that are as nice for people to keep.
Yeah, and I think that, the people who come on your show will be really motivated too, because like, oh, my interview appeared in this book, and this is really, really neat. I mean, I think the kind of high level topic we've been talking about is really just creating, this entrepreneurial way of creating your personal body of work, right? Whether it's an audio form or visual form or code or classes or things. It's just, you in your career path now, it's just important to build up a steady body of work so that you can, whenever opportunities come, if, video becomes really big in whatever years, or VR or something, then you can pivot into that because you have content.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, there's definitely an argument to make sure that you're always writing like a blog post a month. Maybe you're always putting a little bit on YouTube, because you never know what's going to actually matter out of those things. I don't know about you, but I think, oh, I'm going to write this blog post and it's going to be amazing. People are going to love it. And I can't wait to write it and share it. And then, a few people will come, and then I'll write something like, I guess, I got an hour. I'll just throw something out there. And that one gets, thousands of visitors. Like, what? I just have no metric for what is going to be popular. But I know that if you keep doing it, there will be stuff that's popular.
Yep, exactly. I think that's absolutely right. So with the stuff I've written, it's basically, you kind of have a theme that you're interested in, you're an expert in. So you keep on doing stuff in that theme, and some of them will be hits, some of them won't. But the keeping up the momentum is key. So I guess to wrap up, we have a few minutes to wrap up. One of the things that we could think about final thoughts on is, to what extent are you driven currently by your kind of gut intuitions of like, I love doing X, I'm just gonna keep doing X, versus a more methodical A/B testing or businessy perspective of, what do you think appeals to market and such, and how does that balance in your current kind of work world?
Sure. I think in the large scale, it's the business path I'm trying to follow, what I think is best. In the small scale, I try to do what makes me passionate. So what I mean by that is like, in the way I think about spending my time and my days and my energy on the podcast and the courses, and like that, I'm trying to plan that out in the way that I think will be successful, because I feel like success in the podcast is success for the community, right? It's just more stories and whatnot. So I think that that's the right way there. But then when it comes down to like, well, what topic should I have on there? Well, it's what I'm excited about, right? Like if I'm not excited about a topic, but people think it's important, like I might not cover that, right? So it's in the small details, I try to stay excited about what I care about, but there's an overall plan.
I like that. I mean, this is a really practical way to go. And I think this is for a lot of creative people in these fields. There is this dichotomy between following kind of pure passions and somehow market-driven demands. And you have to basically balance this, because as you said, if you're just completely just following market trends and like, oh, people want to learn about deep learning in Python, I don't care about that at all, but I'll just
exactly. But I know it's hot, so let's just go do that. Yeah, exactly. And that won't benefit anybody, because you won't be excited. It won't be a great thing, and so on. Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, awesome. Thank you. Oh, you have a last word.
Yeah, well, a final thought, I guess, on this is if you want to frame this in the sense of, sort of people that are programmers and trying to make their way on the internet doing digital stuff, right? That has some kind of creative component to it. There's one of the things that you have to learn, you have to focus on is marketing your thing. And I have always thought of marketing as kind of like this icky thing that business people do, and I'd rather just write code and stay away from it. But you've got to get the word out about what you're doing. And so if before people get into that, spend a little time learning a bit about how you might promote your thing and so on. Even open source project, a new product, a podcast, blog, whatever.
Yeah, and I think that goes for everything, because it's the way I view this is, for people who want to be heads down in their craft, creating their craft, and not as much worrying about all the other things that maybe are periphery. The way I frame it to people is, do you want to keep on doing this, right? If you want to keep
Exactly.
on doing this, you need to do some of the other stuff in order to sustain.
Right. Maybe just enough so that you have the freedom to just focus on your dream. Right. Absolutely.
That's right. That's right.
So,
awesome. Well, thank you so much, Michael. We'll talk a little bit more offline, but thank you very much for your insights.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been great. And thanks for this opportunity to share it. And I'm really excited that you came on my show, and I was thrilled to see you made a podcast as well in this slightly different format. So congratulations on that too.